So, Mr. Buffett, thank you very much for joining us
My
this
pleasure.
morning. You know, you said at the meeting that you read 5 papers a day.
At
And
least.
I know, yeah, at least 5 papers a day. I know we've probably asked you every question under the sun, but I thought with these new headlines, maybe we could go through some of them and get your thoughts.
Okay.
Okay. Let's start things off with the Wall Street Journal. I brought 5 or 6 papers to just give you a quick quiz off of some of these.
Oh.
First of all, you're all over the papers with the meeting. A lot of papers that have come out. This one on the front of the Journal says the slump has dealt Buffett a rather rough hand. Inside it says Buffett plays down hoopla and hope. But the funny thing I saw was that depending on which paper you pick up, which headline you read, some people say you're very optimistic about the futures. Others say you're very concerned. What's the right take?
Well, maybe they both have got it right. I'm 100% enormously optimistic about the future of this country over time. I mean, there's no way you can bet against America and win. And you know, just look back at a couple hundred years ago, how people were living and how they live now. And we're not any smarter than they were a couple hundred years ago. We got the same land and everything else, but we've unleashed human potential and will continue to do so. So 20 years from now, 50 years from now, your kids and grandchildren are going to live far better than you live. But in the short term, you know, things are going to be tough for a while. And we see no real pickup in a whole variety of businesses we have. But they'll be doing fine in a few years. I don't know whether they'll be doing fine in 3 months, 6 months, 2 years. I know they'll be doing fine in 5 years, and I hope they'll be doing fine in 5 months. I don't know the answer is exactly when.
You say you've seen no real sign of pickup. Have you seen any sign of a slowing in the rate of decline? Or any signs of a bottom, I guess?
Well, certainly in residential real estate in important parts of the country, like California, where they've been in a nosedive, you know, a year ago and 6 months ago, we're seeing a lot more activity, particularly in the medium to lower priced homes. You know, lower mortgage rates help. There have been a few. California had a special program to help. So houses are moving. Now, California's a very big area, so Stockton's not the same as San Francisco would be. But there's a lot of activity, and I would say that the prices have tended to stabilize in a place like that, whereas in South Florida, you've still got a huge oversupply. So, but that's getting better.
Okay. In the Financial Times this morning, the lead story is about Citigroup and Bank of America, how they're each working on plans to raise $10 billion in additional capital. Today was supposed to be the day that we'd be getting those stress test results. You own stakes in 3 out of the 19 banks that are going through the stress test, in Wells Fargo, SunTrust, and U.S. Bancorp.
Right.
Do you know the outcome of the stress test for any of them?
No.
What do you? You've said in the past that you've done your own stress testing.
Yeah, sure. You know, we've got very appreciable money in them, so we know the business model of 2 of those 3 quite well. The third I don't know that well.
Which 2 you know well?
I know U.S. Bank and Wells Fargo. I don't know the business model of SunTrust that well. So I can't talk about SunTrust intelligently, but I can tell you that U.S. Bancorp and Wells Fargo are extremely strong banks. They have terrific earning power, and earning power is enormously important in looking at what happens to a business in the future. And you couldn't have 2 better banks virtually positioned than those 2 for future earnings. They've got things could get a lot worse, and those companies would come through fine.
Does that mean you don't think the government will make them raise additional funds, or once things wind up in Washington, you don't know what's going to happen?
I don't know what's going to happen.
Right. Okay, let's talk about the front page this morning of, or at least the business section of the New York Times. It's got talk about how over the weekend, despite Obama trying to get people to go out and buy cars made in Detroit, they saw little signs of a bump for Chrysler sales over the weekend. Chrysler, obviously, at this point in bankruptcy. What are some of the aftershocks and effects, maybe some of the unintended consequences that could come up from putting Chrysler in bankruptcy, and then what happens to GM? Well,
I think, you know, it is tough to be in bankruptcy if you're not in there very long, and that's the hope of everybody, is that they're out in 60 days or something like that. The disruption is less, but it obviously has to worry dealers. It worries consumers. Now, the government said they stand behind the warranties and everything, so I don't think people should be worried. But they may worry, even though they stand behind the warranties, that the fellow that's been servicing their car, you know, for over the years won't be around in a year or 2. It's very important for Chrysler to get out of bankruptcy very quickly, and that depends on the bankruptcy judge.
There is some talk out there that the bondholders should accept this deal that's been pushed down. Are you sympathetic to that?
Well, I'm sympathetic to both sides on it. I mean, the bondholders bought a secured bond. If I have a first mortgage on my house here, and the first mortgage is for half of what the house is worth, and somebody says, I want you to take a big haircut because I've got some credit card debt someplace else, that's got problems. It has problems in terms of future lending. I mean, if priorities don't mean anything, that's going to disrupt lending practice in the future. On the other hand, to have a few people standing in the way of something that has so much importance to the whole country, I can see why people on the other side are very upset. But giving up priorities in lending, abandoning that principle, would have a whole lot of consequences.
A whole lot of bad consequences down the road.
I think it would. I mean, if we want to encourage lending in this country, we don't want to say to somebody who lends and gets a secured position that that secured position doesn't mean anything. So it's a tough problem both ways.
Okay. Back in studio, Joe and Carl are both standing by, and our guest host today is Senator Judd Gregg. Joe, you have a question as well?
I do. I'm looking at, let's keep doing this with the newspapers for Warren. I'm looking at the Wall Street Journal, Warren. I see the Cherry Coke. That looks to be yours. I can see your hand, your bridge hand, and I see the way you've got it all. You've got a 7 and an 8 of hearts, and then you've got the hearts. You've got everything going in sort of in sequence. I'm wondering, A, do you remember whether you did well with that hand that you have there? And B, the article above it, Warren. In the past, go ahead.
Well, if you don't know whether I did well or not, Joe, I'm going to tell you I did well regardless.
Yeah, I don't know. In the past, you have said to return to some of the capital gains rates and the dividend rates and the marginal rates of the 90s. Not a big deal for corporations. You're okay with that. This latest proposal to tax corporations. Cisco, for example, thinks this is not a great idea and that it's going to hurt U.S. corporations. Could you weigh in on whether you have a problem with this move?
Well, but I can't talk about all the details of this bill because I don't know it. But I would say this, that we're going to raise probably at most $2.3 trillion at the federal level in taxes. So, you know, we were raising close to $2.6 trillion just a couple of years ago, and you know what we're going to spend. So one way or another, we're going to need more taxes down the road. There's no magic wand on this, and then the question is who they should come from, and everybody that is a target of any increases is going to be back in Washington screaming. So the country can take higher tax rates. We did very well, extremely well, in the 60s, in the 90s, with tax rates considerably higher in many areas than now. So I think it's a question of, you know, who gets socked and when. But the one thing I know is if we keep raising $2.3 trillion a year, we're going to have massive deficits for a long, long time, and those have consequences as well.
Well, Mr. Buffett, if I could ask you that, following up on that, what do you do about the debt? I mean, if you're going to explode the debt here, it's sort of like chasing your tail to try to catch up with revenues when you've got a debt ratio that's going up to 80% of GDP. Is that sustainable? And if we're looking at 5 to 6%, 4 to 5% in deficits for the next 10 years and a debt ratio jumping from 40% to 80%, in the long run, how do you get yourself out from underneath that type of a debt situation and the spending which is driving that debt?
Well, at some point you have to have tax revenues that are a whole lot closer to expenditures, and you can get that in two ways, and both ways are unpleasant. But if you don't get it, the consequences are unpleasant as well. And you mentioned going to 80%. It could go, it will go a lot higher than that unless at some point you get a more of a balance between revenues and expenditures. And we started from a fairly low debt position, and of course we came out of World War II with well over 100%. But a country that continuously expands its debt as a percentage of GDP and raises much of the money abroad to finance that, at some point it's going to inflate its way out of the burden of that debt. I mean, every country that's denominated its debt in its own currency and has found itself with uncomfortable amounts of debt relative to the rest of the world, in the end they inflate, and that becomes a tax on everybody that has fixed dollar investments.
Hey, Warren, it's Carl. It's good to see you. One quick question on employment. You know, we had the Chrysler bankruptcy last week. This morning, Filene's Basement is said to be filing for Chapter 11. The Boston Globe may shut down in the coming days. I wonder if you think those types of actions will pose a renewed threat to the economy, or whether we can grind through some sort of jobless recovery like we had in the 90s?
Well, we're going to face more unemployment, and who knows where it tops out. It will top out eventually. I mean, we've hit double digits in the past. We have a wonderful economy over time. The markets overshoot, people make mistakes. I mean, it's not perfect at all times, but we had 6 panics in the 19th century. We had the Great Depression in the 20th century and all kinds of recessions. We do come out of them. How fast we come out of them depends to some extent on the wisdom of the policies in Washington. But the biggest thing that brings us out of them is the fact that we've got a system that works very well over time, even though it gets gummed up periodically. It's gummed up right now. We'll come out well, whether the government does it exactly right or not. But government policy is enormously important. We will have more unemployment. We won't have more unemployment 5 years from now than we have now. I'll guarantee you that. I think it'll be appreciably less. When it turns, I don't know.